Association of Victoria and Tasmania and the Royal Historical Society of Victoria. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I live and work and create on the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Eastern Kulin Nation. I'd also like to pay my respects to their elders past, present and future. And I also extend that respect to all First Nations people joining us tonight. And I invite you to share with us and acknowledge whose country you're on tonight. Use the chat function below and let us know where you are. This event is part of Victoria's History Month, which runs throughout the month of October, supported by the Royal Historical Society of Victoria and the Vera Moore Foundation. Hi, my name is Bec Carland, and tonight I'll be one of your hosts. I'm a really proud member of the Professional Historians Association. I'm also the Senior Curator of the History of Collections at Museums Victoria. And what feels like a really long time ago now, I was also an emerging historian. And I fondly recall how lovely it was and how affirming it was to be selected into this wonderful community, which still to this day continues to sustain and support me. Tonight, we will be bringing you the work of our newest historians, Parro, Dr. Kaylee Myers, Dr. Dilhani Dissanayake, and Dr. Rachel Goldlust. But first, I'd like to introduce my co-host, Dr. Andrew Lemon. Andrew is also a PHA member and has been heavily involved in the Royal Historical Society of Victoria for many, many years now. And I invite him to join me on screen to talk a little more about this amazing collaboration between PHA and RHSV.
Well, thank you very much, Bec, and it is wonderful to see as a graduate of emerging historians, a mere only 9 or 10 years ago, perhaps, when you and Amanda performed on that occasion. So yes, I'm Andrew Lemon. I'm a past president of the Royal Historical Society. Delighted to see that from a message on the screen that our current president, Emeritus Professor Richard Broome, is joining us tonight. And on behalf of Richard and everybody at the RHSV, I welcome everybody. We've got a fantastically full house of Zoomers in there tonight. And that's really encouraging as well. My memories, I've been a foundation member of PHA and have a long involvement with RHSV. But years ago, we had another organisation that Richard certainly remembers, the History Institute Victoria, which was perhaps the first attempt to bring together the broad church of historians, academic historians, and those increasing numbers of historians who were working in the field, starting to try and find a way of making a living as a historian, perhaps not as teaching history at universities. And out of that emerged, one of our first presidents was the late Professor Roger Joyce of La Trobe University, and he was very keen on this idea of getting young historians to come in and give us a lecture and show us the way. And Roger died far too young, and in his memory, we started a thing called the Roger Joyce Memorial Lecture. And in those days, there was just one new historian who was selected. We used to try and find one who'd come out at the top of the tree, but of course that always caused a bit of disarray. But we had some terrific lecturers, and some of those Roger Joyce lecturers also become very eminent historians. But the thing about this is you don't have to be eminent to be a historian. You just have to be in there doing the work and doing having the passion. And for those of us who've been doing this for a long time, it's really, it gives us a new sense of energy to see the new ideas, the new excitement, the new ways of dealing with things. So emerging historians, as it's evolved through the partnership with PHA, as PHA has joined up with Victoria and Tasmania, it really is one of the highlights of the year. So normally we'd be at the RHSV headquarters and we'd be giving you a nice glass of wine and something to nibble before you did your lecture and listen to it. But I hope you're enjoying one of your own at home tonight. Tonight we're going to hear some very diverse stories, and I think that's again one of the exciting things about emerging historians, that the topics that people suddenly find, they come and grab you if you're lucky. A topic you think, what am I going to write about? But suddenly there's a topic that says, no, this is it. You've got to do it, whether you want to or not. So we're going to arrange from the far right in Australia during the interwar period. We're going to look at representations of health, exercise, and the woman body in 19th century Australian print culture. We're going to look at food. We're going to look at cinnamon and food for thought, and that'll get you ready for dinner. And then we're going to look at the environmental history of Australians going off-grid since the late 19th century, all topics which may at one stage have seemed to be obscure historical subjects, but actually they're all front of mind. And I think we might explore a little bit of that tonight. It will be Bec who will introduce each of the speakers and tell you a little bit about them. They have the difficult job of trying to put in just a few minutes what they're thinking about and what they're working about. It's quite a tall order. Then at the end of each speaker, I'll just say a few words and then Bec will introduce the next speaker. So I'm looking forward to that. There will be a chance for you to ask questions, and I might throw up a few ideas at the end of each speaker, and I look forward to joining you a little later in the evening. Thank you, Bec.
Thanks, Andrew. Now, just a little bit of housekeeping before we introduce the first speaker. There is a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. If you have any burning questions during our speakers' presentations, please use the Q&A function, and we'll facilitate a Q&A session at the very end of all the presentations. This session is also being recorded and will be available to all PHA and RHSV members after the event. And also, if you have any technical problems throughout the session, please use the chat function to notify our behind-the-scenes crew and they'll attend to your needs. But now let me introduce our first speaker. Joe Parro is an historian specialising in the far right in Australia. He completed his honours thesis entitled, oh, my apologies. He completed his honours thesis entitled Experiments in Australianity, the Publicist, Australian Nationalism and the Embrace of German National Socialism in 2018. His master's thesis, which he commenced in 2020, explores the publicist author Percy Reginald Inky Stevenson and his engagement with fascism from the interwar period until his death in 1965. In September last year, Joe joined the ARC Discovery Project, Far Right in Australia, Intellectuals, Masculinity and Citizenship. He will be a PhD candidate in this exciting interdisciplinary team led by Professor Brian Turner at the Australian Catholic University. And it's my absolute pleasure to now introduce Joe Parro. Over to you, Joe.
Thanks, Bec, and thanks, Andrew. I'll just share my screen here. There we go. A thumbs up. Looks okay. Great. So I'm going to try in the 6 to 8 minutes allotted to me to do a brief overview of Australian fascism from its adoption to its survival into the post-war period after 1945 through the case studies that I've been working on at the University of Melbourne. Firstly, I want to talk a little bit about what I mean by fascism. What am I talking about when I say fascism? So recently, Angel Alcalde has talked about the transnational turn amongst scholars of fascism. So there's been a movement away from seeing fascism in terms of static regimes or models. So a comparative study, for example, between a static fascist Italy and Nazi Germany. And now we think about fascism as a global movement that spread within and outside of Europe, with actors and ideas circulating between and across national boundaries. So we're talking here about multi-directional processes of transfer, adoption, adaptation, and recontextualization. So I've looked at these processes with this particular case study, Percy Reginald Inky Stevenson. And if any of you are Australian historians or even just interested in Australian history, you might have come across this character. He was a fairly influential author, editor, publisher, and author's agent in Australia. So he published work by people like Miles Franklin, Eleanor Dark, Henry Handel Richardson, Xavier Herbert, and the bestseller Frank Clune. He was also the leader of the very short-lived Australia First movement from 1941 and 1942. And in part, this led to his internment during the remainder of the Second World War under security regulations. So he was considered a national security threat during war. This image on the right, Hail Hitler, a speech to the Reichstag, first installment, is from The Publicist, the paper loyal to Australia First. So this was a paper that Stevenson wrote for. It was published between 1936 and up until Stevenson's internment in 1942. It was a pro-Nazi, pro-Hitler paper, as you can see here. If you can read these words of praise from the editor, W.J. Miles, Stevenson would also use the paper to advocate for the Nazi vision. And he adopted the Nazi vision primarily because of this shared ideology. So there was racial nationalism, Stevenson's support for the White Australia policy, which obviously wasn't marginal at the time, shared a lot with the Nazi blood and soil idea of nationalism. He also advocated for cultural and political revolution. So not just a political revolution, but he was an acolyte of people like Norman Lindsay and Friedrich Nietzsche and D.H. Lawrence, people for who revolution was also cultural and even spiritual. He liked the anti-British stance of Adolf Hitler. So Hitler spoke out a lot about how Germany was kind of downtrodden by the victorious First World War powers, in particular Britain, and he was fighting against that. And Stevenson was an early anti-British Australian nationalist. And he and other Australian nationalists saw Nazi Germany as a successful example of national resurgence. So he not only adopted elements of fascism, but he then adapted them to his own context. I'm going to talk about briefly a specific example. He combined the anti-Semitic conspiracy theories of Nazism, so this idea of Judeo-Bolshevism and international Jewish conspiracy that was behind communism, with the White Australia policy. So on the right, if your screen is big enough, you can have a little read. If not, I'll do just a brief summary. He's basically talking about the so-called Jewish problem in the context of preserving Australian white racial homogeneity and referencing the White Australia doctrine as a founding doctrine of the Australian nation. So he was able to combine these elements that he'd adopted from fascism, that was spreading from Europe, and adapt them to an Australian context. The war was obviously a major turning point in the history of fascism, and this is true in Australia as well. So the context massively changed. Obviously, the Axis powers were defeated. Fascism was stigmatized, so it was now associated with not only loss and powerlessness following the war, but violence and war and genocide. And there were also the extreme experiences of interwar fascists like Stevenson, who had been interred for over 3 years. So the response from those in the movement was to change the formation of the movement, to change their methods of activism, and to change the movement's aims. Roger Griffin talks about the groupuscular right. So we saw the end of fascism as composed of mass movements aiming for popular support. Instead, the right became composed of small, marginalized networks that served to adapt and preserve fascist ideology in this new hostile climate. And they did this through the circulation of materials, information, and ideas, and the provision of mutual support, encouragement, and validation. And this was certainly true in Australia. So on the right here, you can see a man called De Wickham Duluth. He ran a mail order service for far-right material, much of which he sourced from the US and the UK out of his cottage in Queensland. So this is just one of the kind of individuals that I'll refer to as nodes in historical network analysis speak that made up this post-war far-right in Australia. There were lots of different actors in these nodes, and often the categories are overlapping. But there were authors, there were National Socialist activists, there were anti-communists, interwar activists like Stevenson, as well as new generations with links to overseas actors and organizations. They provided mutual support, encouragement, and validation to each other. They circulated material, both domestic and international, information and ideas. And in this way, they enabled the survival of fascism after 1945 and its transmission to future generations. In conclusion, Australian actors played a role in the global spread of fascism. Fascism had an impact in Australia. Actors like Stevenson adopted and adapted fascist phenomena in their own contexts. These phenomena survived the events of the Second World War and post-war stigmatization carried by a small, marginalized post-war network of like-minded actors. Ideology, material, information, support, validation, and encouragement circulated amongst this network. So some future questions that I'll leave with you is, what were the significance of these international links after the war, particularly? What was the impact of changes in communication technologies? Did that have any serious implications for the far-right network? And what happened when that network lost these interwar and wartime generations and it was passed on to actors who had not been present for the initial spread of fascism? Thank you very much.
That was beautifully articulated and also beautifully on time. Thank you, Joe, for that. I think that I'm impressed by the clarity with which you're presenting those ideas and thinking through the way in which we look at historical events, obviously from our perspective, and it's really fascinating to go back as a historian and look at the other side of it to see Stevenson's work as seeming to be less dangerous, less confronting in its early manifestations and fitting in with international nationalism, looking at the same sorts of nationalistic movements that are operating all around the world. So it's a really fascinating experience. I would also be interested to as you develop through these topics, to sort of be thinking through how many people, how many adherents, if you like, were lost along the way. So you're fascinating talking about the way it emerges into the new era, the post-war era. It has to be reconstructed. But are there in fact people who suddenly find themselves actually no longer attracted by the philosophy because they've seen the extent to which it goes? And on the left wing, there's a very similar sort of moment of truth with the with Russian involvement in the 1956 and the revelations about Stalin, making people who felt themselves ideologically very connected with the communists to reassess their positions and so on. So I'm really fascinated by that, and I'm also interested to perhaps get a reflection at some stage from you, Joe, as to whether you saw this as a kind of abstract topic, and yet now right-wing nationalism is right back in the forefront of democratic societies and thinking, that there is that movement, in a sense, which people thought was historical, has suddenly becomes highly relevant to their own political challenges. So a lot of food for thought. You are going to find this a very absorbing topic, and thank you very much for your presentation. Bec, on to our next speaker. Thank you, Jo.
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you, Jo. Our second speaker tonight, Dr. Kaylee Myers, is a historian and cultural heritage practitioner living and working in Melbourne. Her past academic work has examined the representation of landscape in Australian art and its role in settler colonialism, my apologies, the history of cuteness, the past and present aesthetics of girlhood, and the history of physical culture in Australia. She currently works for a conservation architect as a historian and heritage consultant. This evening, Kaylee is going to speak about representations of health, exercise, and the woman body in 19th century Australian print culture. Dr. Kaylee Myers.
Thanks, Rebecca. Okay, so much like Jo, I'm going to start off with a few definitions. So what I've got on the screen there is an image of a drawing of a 19th century gymnasium in Paris. And what's really curious about the gym as this sort of 19th century phenomenon is it has its roots in a very ancient institution. It has its roots linking back to ancient Greece, of course. And then it's sort of this institution that goes completely dormant for millennia. And then it suddenly explodes in popularity again in the mid to late 19th century. And there's a lot of reasons for this. They come from, modernity and the explosion of leisure, colonialism, networks of empire, and changing ideas around health, the body, and of course, eugenics, which is a really curious line running through the history of the gym. But basically what they are, they're these spaces from which it's really interesting to consider the construction of the body and the social body, and specifically the gendered body. So constructions of femininity and masculinity, but also I would argue ways to look at the agency of expression of the self against these socially constructed ideas. Now, gyms in the 19th century coalesce around this idea of physical culture. And what physical culture is in the 19th century is essentially purposeful exercise related to lifting weights. So across the course of the 20th century, it will come to be a bit more specialized. It will begin to form into different streams: bodybuilding, powerlifting, more recently things like CrossFit, and the reemergence of the popularity of strongman and strongwoman. But in the 19th century, it's physical culture, and this really is an interesting global phenomenon. So by about the 1880s, and certainly by the 1890s, you can go pretty well everywhere in the British Empire. You can go through Australia, New Zealand, Canada, you can go to India, you can go also across the US and the sort of informal American empire, parts of Central and South America. And you can say to people, I'm a physical culturalist, and that will be understood in the same way that today people would understand if you said, I am a bodybuilder, I'm a CrossFitter. So it's this really interesting global phenomenon that travels along these networks of empire. And there's three places that it really develops. The first is in schools, the second is in the military, and the third, and the one that I want to focus on today, is really the entertainment industry. So vaudeville acts, the music hall circuit, and circuses. So to give you, there we go. To give you a bit of an idea of the kind of landscape that I'm talking about. This here is a picture of Eugene Sandow. Now, Eugene Sandow is like the godfather of the contemporary fitness industry. So he comes to prominence quite spectacularly after winning a public strength competition in 1889. And from that point, he basically begins to build what is arguably the world's first fitness empire. And what's really curious about Sandow compared to the strong men who had gone before him in prominence is, as you can see there, his incredibly ripped abs. Now, the reason this is important is because he is the first person to really be considered this sort of ideal human form, this ideal and idealized form. And most importantly, Sandow turns around and says, hey, you know what? If you work hard, you too can look like this. And here's how. And he begins to market and monetize his own range of health and fitness products, gyms. He has internationally syndicated gyms. So you can go to a Sandow gym in the US, you can go to one in Australia, you can go to one in London. He has his own grip dumbbells. He markets products. He has his own milk protein powder. He has a cocoa powder that's meant to be something to do with performance. I mean, if he could get behind detox tea, he probably would do that as well. Like, he is the world's first fitness influencer. And he tours Australia in 1902 to 1903, and the response to this, I think, really shows the sort of the global reach of the popularity of this growing idea of physical culture. So people flock to his shows. It's incredibly titillating, I guess you could say. There's this sort of push-pull against like the eroticism of his form. So those that is the outfit that he wore on his tour to do his presentations in Australia. And in a lot of the newspapers, there was this sort of push-pull between, you know, is this overly eroticized versus, no, he's emulating, you know, the statuary of ancient Greece. So it's all very above board, all very classy. So this is the sort of landscape that I'm talking about. And hopefully you can also see some of the sort of reverberations with today as well. This sort of idea of an idealized form, this idea of it's something that everyone can do, everyone can participate in, these sort of like push-pulls with like, with this sort of like idealized form. And then I guess the question becomes, in this sort of origin story of physical culture as a global phenomenon, where do the women fit in? So I'm going to take you through just a couple of very interesting characters. So the first one that I want to look at is Katie Sanduina. So she is born Katharina Brumbach in Vienna in 1884. And she's quite interesting if we look at and break down the representations of her in things like newspapers. So this is an image of her that appears in the National Police Gazette, which is a nationally syndicated magazine. And this is the interview that goes along with it, the writing of her. She's also often depicted in newspapers in cartoons as this sort of giantess, and she is actually taller than her husband. And so her husband is often depicted being held like by her in her hand. Is this rather like effete figure, and then she's this sort of like towering giant of a woman. But what's really interesting about this is, as you can see, there's still this like very strong emphasis on, but she's still incredibly feminine, and importantly, she's still a fantastic mother. And there's this sort of interesting relationship between her strength as a physical culturist and as a strong woman. So the rumor of her name is that she won it from Sandow in a wrestling match. This isn't borne out in the archival record, unfortunately, but that's the sort of mythology that exists around her, that she is stronger than all the men around her, and yet she manages to retain her femininity. And this even contributes to her ability to be a fantastic mother. Another interesting character is Volcano. So she is born Miriam Kate Williams in 1874 in Wales. She's quite stunning, and she's also quite short. So she's 5'4", which is about 161, 163 centimeters, around there. And she has, she's presented in as you can see from this excerpt, and also in a number of newspaper articles, as this sort of very otherworldly beauty figure. She tours Australia in 1904, and in an article, A Chat with Volcano, which opens as referring to her as a little lady, it describes her figure as just sufficiently plump to be pleasing. In evening dress, she would look charming, for her neck and shoulders are perfectly developed. So again, much like Katie Sanduina, we can see this idea of her involvement in physical culture, her involvement in the practice of lifting weights, her strength, contributing to and even emphasizing her femininity, or at least not taking away from it. And this is quite interesting with these two characters, Volcano and Katie Sanduina, that there is this sort of idea of the two existing together and even creating each other. And it's not always the case. So you have someone say like Minerva, who certainly fits more into like the Titan narrative as opposed to the sort of giant of a woman, the overspilling of womanness and femininity. She's far more that sort of very traditional strong woman figure. And she is really just celebrated for her strength. So she holds the Guinness World Record for the most amount ever lifted by a woman, which is 3,564 pounds in a hip and harness in 1895. That's over 1,600 kilos. And her feats are reported widely in Australia as well. And she is described in those articles as this Titaness, as this almost like figure from Mount Olympus, she exists almost outside of the ideas of femininity. She's almost beyond that. She's almost more than human in these constructions. So this is basically just a little taster. And just what I want to leave you with is this sort of idea of how this might develop and what kind of questions this might prompt for looking back and looking forward. Because the way that this develops over the course of the late 19th and into the 20th century, say physical culture, the way it develops for men is there's this direct line from Sandow and his magnificent abs in the first bodybuilding competition. And it's all very like idealized masculinity, and the stronger and harder you are, the better, et cetera, et cetera. And for women, it's really a lot more, for the representations of the women body in this space, it's a lot more complex, and there's a lot more, I guess, moral panicky sort of atmosphere going on. So I just want to very quickly share one final story of Bev Francis. And this is her open powerlifting total. Basically, the reason I'm going to Bev Francis, because we're jumping to the 1980s here, and the birth of women's bodybuilding. And whilst the birth of men's bodybuilding, one really happened with Sandow in 1902 with the first bodybuilding competition, and then solidified in international popularity in the 50s and 60s, and has really remained unchanged except for the expansion of categories, women's bodybuilding didn't get going until the 1980s. And Bev Francis, who was an Australian powerlifter, very, very celebrated, brilliant in her field, then transitioned over to bodybuilding. And she took part in the Miss Olympia contest in 1980. And there's actually a documentary about a show in the lead up to this, and it's Pumping Iron 2. So Pumping Iron was the one that launched Arnold Schwarzenegger. Pumping Iron 2 was about the women. And what was interesting about this is she competed in the most muscular category, and she was the most muscular woman on that stage. There is no doubt that she should have taken the crown, and yet she placed second. And when she comes off the stage, she says, "Did I look too manly?" And the answer is essentially yes. And I think that's very interesting to consider in the sort of a retrospect, looking back to the 19th century, in terms of when do we begin to see this shift from the potential for physical culture to emphasize one's femininity to the potential for it to go completely the other way, and there to be no space for femininity in lifting or in strength. And yeah, I'll leave you with that thought.
Terrific images that you've given us as well, Kaylee. Thank you very much for that. And you have a terrific gift for topics, for naming your topics. I think that you obviously are always going to attract readers' attention as you work through the topics that are of interest to you. I have mentioned to you before, Kaylee, that we have some common interest in that. In that I've also done some work on the history of gymnastics in Australia, and so I can give a plug for an article that I wrote in a Victorian Historical Journal maybe a couple of years ago about the man who attempted to introduce fencing and physical culture, as well as the Germans in the middle part of the 19th century. It's a topic which I think is really engaging as we look at. I'm sure that there is a theme about the urbanisation and this kind of almost you see there's a sort of death wish in Western Europe through that later part of the 19th century, but a sense that as people moving into the cities, what are they going to do with their physical energies and how are they going to express it? And so there's been some really interesting work and studies done in this field, which you'll obviously be very well aware of. And I think that continuing to look at that culture is going to be extremely fascinating. So really looking forward to more of your work and to find out where it takes you. So I know there'll be questions at the end. Bec, let's have a look at our third emerging historian, and thank you, Kaylee, very much.
Thank you both. And Kaylee, I'm really taken by your work. I can't wait to hear more. Our next speaker this evening is Dr. Dilhani Dissanayake, who is a historian, academic, and researcher. She has studied a rich mix of colonial, imperial, Asian, and labour histories alongside commodities and food history and community development. She achieved an honours degree at the University of Colombo, Sri Lanka, and postgraduate diploma in community planning and development at La Trobe University. She is currently an academic at La Trobe, having completed her PhD on cinnamon and cinnamon peelers in 2019. She is currently undertaking a new project, the Bendigo Food for Thought workshop series, using a community engagement model to discuss the social and cultural value of food. She is also working on a book proposal to publish her PhD thesis, and it's our absolute pleasure to introduce tonight Dr. Dilhani Dissanayake. Over to you, Dilhani.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. I'll share my screen with you first. Cinnamon and cinnamon peelers, that is my PhD research. Today I picked a part from the big topic to share with you, which is the cultural value of cinnamon. Cinnamon as a spice, today most commonly known as a food additive, comes from the inner bark of the cinnamon tree. Ceylon cinnamon or Cinnamomum salinicum trees are native to Sri Lanka and grew abundantly in the wild in pre-colonial times, which produce the highest grade pure cinnamon. Cinnamon becomes a usable and sellable product after it has been carefully peeled and processed from the inner bark of the tree, either as quills or as a powder. Cinnamon particularly attracted the attention of European empires, the Portuguese, Dutch, and the British, who ruled successively over Sri Lanka from 1505 to 1948. The Portuguese were the first European empire to colonize and to control the cinnamon monopoly in Sri Lanka. Then the Portuguese were followed by the Dutch in 1658, who in turn were replaced by the British in 1796. The British controlled the cinnamon trade until at least 1833, when the British colonial government monopoly of the trade was abolished. Cinnamon peelers are who worked in cinnamon production in pre-colonial and colonial periods, and even today. Cinnamon processing is labor-intensive. Peeling requires local knowledge, skill, dexterity, and care to produce the best quality cinnamon. Therefore, peelers and their families were increasingly in demand within the monopolized cinnamon trade in Sri Lanka's colonial history. Cinnamon has come to represent Sri Lankan culture and its people's identity. Peoples were among the agents who expanded Sri Lankan culture beyond the island shores. Until now, the importance of peelers' role as cultural agents has not been investigated in the literature. Yet, cinnamon was consumed over many centuries by the Europeans and the locals. My research then comes to the first research on cinnamon and cinnamon peelers from pre-colonial to today. Cinnamon is deeply embedded in the origin stories of Sri Lanka. The representation of cinnamon in Sri Lankan culture harks back to as early as the story of the arrival of Prince Vijaya. In Mahavamsa, Great Chronicle, the first civilization in Sri Lanka begins with the legend of the arrival of Prince Vijaya in the 5th century. It was believed that when the Vijaya first touched the seashore in Sri Lanka, it turned their hands to a red or copper color, and the country started to be known as Thambapani. Thamba means copper, and Pani means beach or hands. But in some stories, Pani means leaves, and the copper leaves indicate the young leaves of cinnamon trees. This legend connects with the abundant growth of cinnamon trees in Sri Lanka close to the sea. Whatever the truth of this legend, this connection of cinnamon to stories of the early settlement of Prince Vijaya hints at the strong relationship between cinnamon and the local culture. Once cinnamon started to be processed as a usable spice, it became culturally significant to Sri Lanka and represented the Sri Lankan people and culture. Kurundu is the most commonly used Sinhalese word for cinnamon. Kurundu has been widely attached to Sri Lankan culture. It is believed that the Malvathu Oya was known as Kurundu Oya or Cinnamon River after Vijaya and his followers settled there. Similarly, there have been several rivers, villages, roads, and temples with names beginning with Kurundu from 543 to 505 BCE. For example, Kurundu Ganga Alla, Kurundu Oya Alla, and Kurundu Dua. This shows how cinnamon embedded itself into Sri Lankan culture since the earliest day of the First Kingdom. Cinnamon has a long history as a multi-purpose spice beyond the shores of Sri Lanka. It had been used as a preservative, a medicine, and as a symbol in religious rituals. The ancient Egyptians, for example, used it in embalming mummies because of its pleasant aroma and its preservative qualities. In ancient Rome, cinnamon was burnt on funeral pyres to cover the scent of burning flesh. One legend suggests that the Roman Empire Nero burned cinnamon on the funeral pyre of his second wife, Poppaea, in 65 CE to atone for his role in her death. According to the legend, Arabia does not produce as much spice in a year as the Emperor Nero burnt in one day alone with the body of his beloved wife. Cinnamon is noted in the Bible as an ingredient in Moses' anointing oil as a symbol of friendship between lovers. The Israelis on occasions employed it for ritual sacrifice, and the Hindus for burning people's bodies. During the Middle Ages, cinnamon also was known as a medicine to cure various ailments, including cough and indigestion. Alongside its medicinal, symbolic, and ritual value, cinnamon became an additive to food, especially meat, acting as a preservative and adding flavor. In Imperial Rome, cinnamon was a very expensive commodity, highly prized by the wealthy. Western elites who could afford the spice used it in meals for flavor and to impress those around them with their ability to purchase a condiment from the exotic East. These elites showed off their status at banquets by offering a plate with various spices piled high upon it as a sign of their wealth. Well, it is clear that cinnamon has never been confined solely to the cookery pot, whether as a spice in curries or a flavor in baking. Cinnamon is an extraordinary commodity which has come to represent Sri Lankan culture far beyond its economic value. The allure of exotic cinnamon brought travelers and empires to Sri Lanka, where they became fascinated by the island's beauty. The cinnamon's industry helped Sri Lankan culture to achieve an important niche in the world. Thank you very much for listening.
Dilhani, video. Here I am, back again. Thank you very much for spicing up our evening tonight. And one of the things that really immediately occurs to me is that so many people take food and where it comes from for granted. And I'm absolutely sure that when you've talked to people about your project and so on, people will have been asking you, where does cinnamon come from? I'm just imagining that somehow it comes out of some little tube that comes out of the grocers. And I think that it connects in a way to what Kaylee was talking about, that there's urbanization in the 19th and into the 20th centuries has really divorced a lot of people in the world from where the real world is. And I know we're going to talk about that with Rachel in her presentation in a moment. I think it's really important for historians to concentrate on this topic of where different foods and different elements have come from and the evolution of that. So I'm sure that you'll have a huge amount of interest in that. There is a great emerging interest in food and the role it plays in culture. Back in the 1980s, there was a book, I think by Michael Simons, called One Continuous Picnic, which is probably one of the earliest academic studies of the way people ate and used food in Australia. And in a way, I can remember people talking at the time saying that's a slightly odd subject, but I think it's now, again, mainstream. So your focus on that is very fascinating, and I'm sure as you apply your historical research into your community work, that will be a great benefit to it. So thank you for a fascinating presentation, Dilhani. So now moving on to our last speaker, Bec.
Thank you both again. Now, finally, I'd like to introduce our last speaker for the night, Dr. Rachel Goldlust. Rachel completed her PhD at La Trobe University in 2020 after studying the environmental history of the move off-grid across Australia. With a background in planning, sustainable building and environmental education, Rachel is interested in the history of environmental thinking and activism, ex-urban migration, sustainable lifestyles and design, cooperative living systems, gardening and permaculture, and 20th century political, social and oral history. We are thrilled that Dr. Rachel Goldlust is able to share her current and future research with us tonight. Over to you, Rachel.
Thank you, Bec, and thank you to the the PHA and the RHSV for inviting us to share our work. I want to acknowledge that I'm currently sitting on the unceded lands of the Jara people, and the Jara lands, the Dja people, and most of my research was conducted while I was living and working on the Wurundjeri and Woiwurrung people. I'm going to give a brief outline of my thesis, and it's a very long history, so this is a very short and concise version of it. and it is hopefully going to be turned into a book, which I'm trying to work up as a manuscript at the moment. So quickly go into definitions. Living off-grid. The expression has emerged mostly in the last 2 decades, and it refers to the decision of individuals, families, and communities to live outside of the electricity grid servicing the area. But while some people might see that definition as limited to just services and utilities, in many cases, the decision to move off-grid is made in conjunction with a range of activities that represent a more diffuse and complex engagement with societal norms, economic systems, and the natural world. So this journey is definitely not new, and Australians have long sought to escape the cities and go back to the land, and they have done so for a wide range of reasons. It has at times been spurred on, much like the current moment that we are enduring at the moment, by global or financial crises, by government settlement schemes and policies, the excitement of smaller, greener technologies, ideas of gender equality, and even spiritualism and religious activism. So much academic research has focused on the tide of rural to urban migration and regarded those who went upcountry or gone bush as eccentrics or the rejects and rejectors of society, rather than as activists or political commentators in their own right. I'm arguing that the recurring desire to go back to the land has consistently demonstrated a liberal and rebellious cultural and economic tradition that has both resisted and responded to the forces of modernity. I'm also arguing that it has become a critical feature of modern environmental thinking. So the decision to go back to the land is never made in a historical vacuum. And in this study, it's been guided by a quest for the good life. So emerging out of the Industrial Revolution, happiness and fulfillment were aligned with the great promise of the cities, the potential of technology, an acquisition of wealth and possessions, upward social mobility, and political participation. But with a focus on rising industrialism and materialism, a new wave of reformers began from the late 1880s to tap into a conceptual lineage that had reframed ideas about fulfillment around the idyllic countryside. A largely middle class and increasingly transnational movement drew inspiration from texts such as these, alongside the ideas of social visionary William Morris and the romanticism of American agrarian and politician Thomas Jefferson. So during the emergent crisis of the 1892-93 Depression, Australian reformers took these universalist ideas and tried to address the growing problems facing both urban and rural areas alike. Beginning with government-sponsored small land schemes came some stability for workers who soon became small farmers, but women were largely excluded unless they were standing by the side of their husbands, sharing in their misfortune and doing their full share of the toil. So, mimicking the language of nation building, some suffragists started to capitalise on this scheme and sought their own opportunities to move into light agriculture and small farming. From the 1920s onwards, the lure of the pastoral found popular resurgence through the nationwide country life movement. This movement united public and political sentiment and reaffirmed the moral superiority of rural areas and small towns. Through the post-war period, these ideas continued as people started to seek out the good life with a greater recognition of the natural world. This is the point when farmer Elaine Mitchell, famous for authoring The Silver Brumby, published her book Soil and Civilization, which was in 1948, and it was in an attempt to connect Australians to ecosystem thinking. Her sentiment grew at a time when there when there was a growing collection of farmers across the southeast, across Tasmania, New South Wales and Victoria, who had united through organic and compost associations and realised that nature could teach profound lessons to the social reformer. From the 1970s, small farming combined elements of independent proprietorship with household self-sufficiency, but had reframed the concept of traditional yeomanry to be geared towards quality of life over the more material security concerns of their parents and previous generations. Becoming autonomous from the marketplace saw people looking to regain control and give their lives meaning in ways that consumerism and materialism would never allow. The number of urban and rural Australians engaged in what was known as alternative lifestyles during the 1970s has been variously estimated at between 60 and 100,000 people. But such participation has long been marginalised as an effective form of social and political dissent. A main focus of my last 3 chapters of my thesis and a core component of my future, hopefully future book, it will be based on a series of oral history interviews that I undertook with over 35 people who are all post-1970s back to the landers. So in this project, I travelled pretty much to every state and sampled a very broad range of ages, proximity to urban centres, family configurations, sexuality, gender, and their relative time on the land. Structured around a loose life history framework, the interviews explore both individual and collective narratives and a number of shared themes that were located within generationally specific contexts. Oral history provided a vital way to unpack some of the myths and structures of meaning that were attached to this particular lifestyle and series of choices that led people to move onto the land, with an eye to an emergent environmental position. I was also keenly interested in the way women had re-evaluated and reconstructed ideas of home, labour, traditionalism and domesticity within broader moves for social change. So, as historian Richard White's discussion of work in environmentalism concludes, he says that some activities are done in close relationship with the landscape can evoke a bodily knowledge of the natural world. From my research and the extensive interviews that I conducted, I found that far from the mythology around dropping out, most people had made their move off-grid, were very conscious and often proactive about the kind of life and the kind of society that they wanted to help build and create for their children. By working with their hands, building their homes, growing food, and sharing knowledge with their community, both physical and digital, they were reforming bonds increasingly severed by neoliberalism, capitalism, and modernity. This shift in lifestyle is often tethered to a certain political radicalism that is not easily identifiable in visible social movements or organised political actions. It is also long underrepresented in narratives around material sustainability and environmental activism. I'm hoping through my PhD and through my book that I can start to change this. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Having a slight technical problem getting the video back on, but I think I'm here again. No. Look, I'm just going to speak to you through the darkness, and I'll start my video. Am I back? Yes, I'm back. Rachel, what I really loved about that presentation was you were doing a very specific project, and yet you had contextualized it so well. In other words, you're not just jumping into this thinking, wouldn't it be interesting to go and talk to people about living off the grid? You're really starting from a real need to understand the historical background, apart from the fact you have some fantastic images. I just love I love compost news. I think that should be reinstated as a regular RHSV publication. And of course, Bush Week. That used to be, I had one of those teachers at school who, whenever we would come into a disorganized room, would say, "What do you think it is? Bush Week." So I'm speaking to you from Wurundjeri country out in Eltham in a mud brick house, but if I was off the grid, I probably wouldn't have the internet or the electricity working. Very fascinating to see the evolution of alternative technology as well. Something which I in this family we still subscribe to, even though we don't manage to put many of the ideas into action. And fascinating to see the way it moves from a kind of alternative version back in the 80s that you showed us to a rather slick modern version to say you're not actually a weird dropout if you're going to adopt some of these technologies. So a lot of food for thought in all of that. I see a theme through this, Bec, in our 4 presentations of a real interaction with this question of urbanisation, of what living in the 19th and 20th centuries as people crowded into cities, how it changed lives. And I think that that's a real theme through each one of these presentations. So sometimes you can have 4 completely different topics and yet they can come together. Enough from me. Bec, would you like to see if we've got some time for some of those great questions?
Thank you both. And please don't disappear, Rachel. If you want to leave your camera on, I'm going to invite Dilhani and Joe and Kaylee back on screen. We have eaten up our whole hour so quickly. Your presentations were so enthralling. But look, we have got questions. So for those of our visitors, our viewers who wish to stick around, I think we will dive into a couple of them. Kaylee, the first question is for you. William Metcalf suspects there might be a connection between physical culture, for men at least, and the fear of masturbation during the mid-19th and 20th centuries. Can you comment, please?
Yeah, that's an interesting thought. I haven't personally come across anything explicitly linking the two, but there is certainly an idea or a suggestion that activities such as masturbation, sex, or other appetites of the flesh are, I guess, needlessly energy taking. There is also a strong movement at this time with, say, muscular Christianity, and certainly there would be particular morality ideals around the body as this vessel that one is honing in order to like be more respectful to be closer to God, and certainly there would be morality there most likely, but there isn't. I haven't come across anything as explicit as, say, in the nutrition field at this time. I'm thinking of people like, say, Kellogg, and his sort of invention of cornflakes as a bland food that takes away the lust for life and therefore the desire to masturbate. But then again, he was also a huge fan of oatmeal, which is a link back to gym culture there as well. So I'm sure it's there, but I haven't come across it explicitly stated.
I'm muted, sorry. I was going to say food for thought, as they say. Next question is for you, Dilhani. Rosemary Cameron asks, in your images, it looks like the pillars were cutting down the cinnamon trees at ground level, and she's wondering, how do they survive that rough treatment?
Well, not from the ground, they left some stem. When peelers cut the trees, so then there's a special angle, so 45 degrees, because by doing that, they expect to give good care, like good sunlight, and also avoid to collect water on the stem. And also after they cut, they care, like they give just dried leaves and other clear, just put those cinnamon leaves around the ground and to make it really caring. And I think it really survived, and it's really good to go.
So the leaves were placed as kind of a cushioning agent.
Yeah, and they just don't cover, like and also leave stem and also 45-degree angle to get enough sunlight and not to collect water on the stem. So that's kind of caring. So they survive.
Great, thank you. I'm going to jump to Richard Broom's question for Jo. How widespread were these post-war nodes of fascism?
Thanks, Richard. It's hard to say. You kind of have to make these delineations. So people who would openly identify as supporters of National Socialism or fascism, there were very few. But of course, then there were other people who shared the ideology without explicitly identifying themselves as fascists. There would be slightly more. And then you would get into people who helped to spread the ideologies and were connected to members of the far right, but who would never think of themselves as being associated in any way with that network. So Andrew Moore, for example, has argued that the far right after the Second World War was basically redundant because the Menzies government was so draconian in their anti-communism that there was no political space for a separate far right. So these distinctions between who's in the mainstream, who's part of the fascist network are very difficult to make.
Thank you. Rachel, we do have it's kind of a question or perhaps a point of interest for you from Karen Wicks, who says, I live in northeast Victoria and there is a pioneer education camp in the Glen Valley for teenagers, which is off the grid. And are you aware of that? The camp is called Mittagundi.
I think I have heard about that, but in more in regards to outdoor education, possibly, which is not 100% related. I had to be quite delineative about who I was looking at, because I was looking at people who weren't necessarily off-grid by accident, but who had made a definitive decision that that was what they wanted to do to shape their engagement with broader systems and economies and nature. So a lot of people, when I talked about my research, would say everyone was off-grid before the 1950s. There was no electricity. And, you know, that is the case. So I had to make it about the intention.
Yeah. Look, Richard Broom has posted some observations and questions for a few of our speakers. Kaylee, he's also asking, might the Bjelke Peterson Studios 1892 to the present be a good focus for study, as well as overseas performers, to get a sense of the widespread nature of fisty?
I think that might be an autocorrect. I think it might be fizzy. I'm going to guess, which is what the Bjelke Peterson schools is sort of colloquially known as. And they are the schools of physical culture. This is one of those sort of curious word play things. So they certainly are an interesting case study. And I think there is certainly a lot to say there about ideas of the body and specifically femininity, since they are they tend to be attended by girls and young women, and they are hugely popular throughout the east coast of Australia from their inception until today. They are related to what I'm looking at, especially through that history of gymnastics and that sort of that broader set of 3 different avenues through which this develops that I pointed out at the beginning, specifically that sort of idea of the school, and I mean that in a very broad sort of institutional sense, so this idea of physical education as well as within the school itself. They aren't quite what I personally am looking at, mainly because I'm more interested in what's essentially the iron game. So that sort of the purposeful exercise built around the idea of weightlifting and altering one's body with weights, and that sort of relationship to vaudeville acts and strong women and strong men. So it certainly is an interesting case study, but one that I haven't personally looked into in enough detail to speak further on.
Okay, and Jo, I have a question. Can you give me some more concrete examples of the kinds of relationships that existed amongst the post-war far right?
Concrete examples, sure. So there was a guy called Tom Graham, who was kind of an itinerant worker who lived between England and Australia, and he was actively trying to strengthen the post-war National Socialist network to succeed where the pre-war one had failed. So he was in touch with Stevenson. He was in touch with some wealthy backers of a far-right movement. He was in touch with people like Duluth. He was in touch with the League of Rights based in Melbourne, but a national body. And he also had connections to a couple of high-profile far-right publications in the US and some influential actors in Britain. So he was one individual who identified as a National Socialist and had a variety of these connections. And then there were some people like the architect Hardy Wilson, who wrote an anti-Semitic book in 1945 called Instinct, which basically echoed Hitler's rhetoric about the Jews and the Gentiles in their inherent capabilities for building civilization. And so Stevenson helped him by encouraging him. He would send out his book, Instinct, to all these politicians in Australia and the US and the UK. He didn't receive much of a response, but he was in contact with Stevenson, and Stevenson provided encouragement and support, saying, it's a good message. You got to keep trying. And he would suggest, send it to Gandhi, send it to this person. So those are 2 very different case studies for you, someone who identified as a National Socialist, and then someone who was an architect, a reasonably successful architect and artist in Australia, who was still spreading this fascist-inspired message.
Thank you. Look, I think we have time for one last question. Dilhani, Richard Broom asks, was the control of cinnamon a key locus of empire in British Ceylon, or in what ways?
Well, from beginning to until 1833, then 1833, British diversified the Sri Lankan economy. So they introduced coffee, tea, and other plantation system, and also they opened the economy, and they abolished the monopoly on trade, and also the customary labor, so compulsory labor system. So it's basically Portuguese, Dutch, and the British before 1833. It's all they all enjoyed having profit from the lucrative trade of cinnamon. So it's mainly, yes, until 1833 for British, then it's all changed.
Okay, thank you. Well, I think we've covered most of our questions tonight, and I will, before we wrap up, I'd like to thank all of our emerging historians tonight for sharing your expertise and joining us all tonight. I'd like to thank too the events committee of the Professional Historians Association for doing the heavy lifting tonight, and in particular, Michelle Blake and Sophie Couchman. And before I hand over to Andrew for the final word this evening, I'd like to remind you all that the History Council of Victoria's annual lecture is coming up on Thursday, the 21st of October at 5:30. So please remember to book for that. But now I'll hand over to Andrew for the closing remarks.
Well, Bec, first of all, thank you to you for all the hard work that you put into presenting this evening. It's actually gone extremely smoothly, which is most unusual for a Zoom event. So thank you to Michelle and to Sophie and everybody involved, and to Rosemary Cameron at the RHSV. We will certainly emerge again. I hope we might emerge in person next year, but it's also part of our thinking is this is a great way also to spread this more widely. And so all of us will be thinking about ways in which we can take Zoom presentations or online presentations as out of the live area as well. But we do really look forward to the chance of getting together again. But it has been a really stimulating evening at so many different levels, and there are lots of questions I'd like to and conversations I'd like to keep going. So this is a taster plate. Thank you, Dilhani, for bringing out the food element here, because this is a real taster, as you say, and we look forward to the final events. Thank you also, Bec, for mentioning the History Council of Victoria's next annual lecture. And we at the RHSV also put on regular events, and it is History Month. There is dancing in the street. There is a lot going on in historical societies all around Victoria. And I think that those of us who work in the RHSV understand that connection with community history is really important, whether you're an academic historian or a practicing amateur at home. Your local historical society is a terrific network, so do make use of it. And if you're not a member of the RHSV, do think about joining us and getting some of the benefits. Next Tuesday, the 19th, I think it is, so a week from tonight, we'll be having a talk. I'm really looking forward to some of the themes that are here tonight. The Women of Little Lon, the new book by Barbara Minchinson, coming out partly out of the excavations that were done when there was demolition around that Little Lonsdale Street area. That'll be on a Zoom, which you can book through the RHSV. On Monday, the 1st of November in the afternoon, I'll be giving a talk through the Old Treasury about, like it or loathe it, the Melbourne Cup and what it means to Australia, now being rebranded as the race that starts the nation. And I'll be looking at the social and political history of the Melbourne Cup and why people either like it or loathe it. So a few things to look forward to. It's just been a terrific night. Thank you all for being with us as we turn off your screens. We'd just like to again thank you for putting the time aside and supporting our emerging historians. And look out for their blockbusters when they're next past you. Good evening to you all.